All right, well, it's 12 o'clock, so we can go ahead and get started. Hi, everyone. I want to welcome you all to the Montana Institute on Ecosystems Rough Cut Seminar Series. Next week, we will be hearing from Dr. Andy Hogue, who will be speaking on ecological statistics in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. So I hope you all can join us for that. And today, I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Bob Peterson, a professor of entomology at Montana State University. Dr. Peterson leads the research, teaching, and outreach program in the agricultural and biological risk assessment. More specifically, the program is centered on comparative risk assessment. Additional areas of research emphasis include insect ecology, plant stress, ecophysiology, and integrated pest management. As a reminder, this seminar is being recorded, and we ask that you turn your cameras and microphones off during the presentation and save your questions for the end of the talk. And without further ado, I'll hand it over to you, Dr. Peterson.
Well, thank you, Paige. It's great to be here. I wish we could all be in a room. I think everyone starts with that, but we're hopefully almost over having kind of video presentations exclusively, although it does allow, this format does allow for broader participation, which is a great thing. I think we all want to all be together again and are looking forward to that. And also thank you, Paige, for the invitation. Paige took my risk assessment class in fall of 2020, which was online only because of the pandemic. And so I guess it was positive enough experience for her to ask me to give a seminar for the Rough Cut. So that's at least a good feeling on my part, for sure. And thank you to all the others who were involved in recommending that I present today. So with that, I will jump right in, and please let me know, I guess Paige will, if there's any problems with audio or video. Okay, so today I want to talk, it's really kind of a thought or conceptual seminar for sure. It's going to be very data light, which some of you may be appreciative of, others might be concerned about. But anyway, it's going to be very broad and conceptual. And you'll see where I'm going with this as I kind of get into it. Okay, hopefully you all see the second slide. And so this is a slide you might think, ooh, is this something to do with COVID? And the answer is no. These are all patients of West Nile virus, and has the slides have to, or the images have to do with West Nile virus. And one thing that is interesting is we often think, even though West Nile virus is a mosquito transmitted disease, the mosquito transmits the virus that then has the potential to cause disease in people and in birds and in a few other animals, that we often think of this as a public health issue, that it's a virus and it's a person and the person's sick, so it's a public health, individual health issue. And actually it's more than that. That when we talk about a disease such as West Nile virus, it's much more than public health. We have to deal with issues of the environment, environmental health, environmental science. There's a lot of interacting factors here with respect to West Nile virus and the disease that it causes in humans. We have obviously the influence of an involvement of certain mosquito species, but we also have the involvement of birds. It's really mostly a bird disease. And as you can see here, it throws itself out into the human population under the right conditions. Well, what determines those conditions? Well, this is where you bring in other aspects. It's not just animals and people of course are animals, and a virus. It involves the landscape and environmental factors, both abiotic and biotic. And so we're talking about air, soil, and water, and the factors associated with those interacting with the biotic components of the environment that then all combine in very complex ways to produce disease. And so again, that's often forgotten about. And so, how does that work? How are these interactions occurring? Again, this is just a nice figure I ran across in the literature. It's not mine. And it shows these interactions with, when you talk about, in this case, MBD is mosquito-borne disease risk. That's right at the very center of this diagram. And you're dealing with a pathogen and maybe a vector like in this case, a mosquito. You're often talking about much, much more. And there's a sociological component, there's a physical environment component, a biotic environment component, and all these things that combine. And we need to understand all of those things to better understand how to protect people, how to protect the environment, how to protect wildlife, if that's the case, when it comes to this. And this is just another nice diagram that I saw in a paper and plucked it out. And it shows kind of nicely, with a little bit of an emphasis on climate and climate change, what we might be facing with respect to changing prevalence of mosquito-borne diseases in the environment, West Nile virus in particular, but also several other diseases as well. And as you can see here, the diagram, the graphic, pulls in climate and terrestrial factors and habitat factors. So again, air, soil, water, the landscape itself, landforms, in addition to kind of what we commonly think of as, well, what's happening with the virus, what's happening with the mosquito that transmits the virus, and then what's happening with people. It all combines in very, very complex ways. And so, and often when we need to manage diseases like this, when they outbreak in the population in areas, that we often deal with managing the population by managing, in this case, the mosquitoes that are, the female mosquitoes that are carrying the virus, wanting to feed on our blood and then pass the virus on. And to manage those mosquito populations, to knock them down such that we reduce the risk of disease in human populations and in many cases wildlife populations, we have to use techniques that the public is concerned about. And so those interact with environmental features in many complex ways that we need to understand. And I'll come back to that in a bit. So often there are questions by the public, by decision makers, by policymakers. Well, what are the risks? Is the risk of West Nile virus, the disease, greater than the risk of managing that disease? And so there are questions of comparative risks, as I'll talk about much more as we get into this. And so now turning to COVID, it also applies to COVID. We think of, COVID is a respiratory virus that is transmissible through respiratory particles. It's a little more than a respiratory virus, as we've all learned. It's a pan-organ virus, and we're learning more all the time, obviously. But one thing we do know is that it's not just a human-to-human transmission. It's a zoonotic disease and virus, and that is something we have to be concerned about and know about, obviously. And what's missing here from this diagram that I saw in a paper is kind of the interactions with the environment. But when you see all those species, it's implied that there's a lot of interactions as well with the environment when it comes to that. We all know about the bat, and we know about the virus, and we know about person-to-person transmission, but we don't know. Often we forget that it's other animals are involved. And this is like an ancient paper now when it comes to COVID. This is last year. And what have we learned since then? What's missing from this is we know just recently that COVID is found throughout white-tailed deer populations and deer populations throughout North America now. Very surprising. And so obviously there are issues associated with the environmental factors that go into determining this disease situation. Okay, well now for the really fun part that that everyone looks forward to in a talk, and that is we have to kind of have some definitions so we know what we're talking about when we're talking about um, the role of the environment and disease and public health, environmental health. And so the fun epistemological portion of the talk here, but I think it's important. We do have to talk about these things. Well, I've got this simple cheesy clip art that I put together that involves kind of what I view as islands in a sense, and that is you've got environmental science or the environmental sciences as one island, environmental health as another island, and then public health as the third island. And for many of you listening in today, you know that there's tremendous interaction between these things. But I think for a lot of folks, they don't think of the interactions quite so prevalently when it comes to especially the interaction between public health and environmental science. So first, let's define environmental science, and you can see here the dynamics between Earth systems, flora, fauna, and humans. So pretty broad, involves research on air, water, soil, food, and wildlife to help understand system processes, right? And then for our purposes, notice it says here, identify environmental damage or hazards. That gets us closer to environmental health and public health, and develop solutions to environmental concerns. And so, well, if you can't believe learn.org, I don't know who you can believe. So I saw this and liked it, and it is from learn.org, an authoritative source. But there are many definitions for environmental science, and I wanted to pick one that I thought fit, but also one that's kind of readily available on the internet. But there are many, many definitions. Now, turning to environmental health, you can see here, and this is from study.com. I love these sites, these websites. But you notice here, involves understanding the impacts of environmental and human-made hazards and protecting human health and ecological systems against these hazards. And you can read the rest there, and it ends with what influences the spread of diseases. And so we're talking about environmental diseases, not in the case, we are talking about infectious-borne disease, but also talking about like heavy metals in the environment as one, radiation risk and disease as another when it comes to environmental health. And then finally, public health, and this is a definition from American Heritage Dictionary, the science and practice of protecting and improving the health of a community. Stressing community there, I'm going to stress it for sure, as by preventive medicine, health education, control of communicable diseases, application of sanitary measures, and monitoring of environmental hazards. So you can see by these three definitions, there's appreciable overlap between all three. And that's my argument for sure. It's definitely not unique to me because it's there, it's out there. I didn't think probably I'd have to even define public health, but as we've seen with this, with the global pandemic with COVID-19, that there was a lot of either ignorance about what is public health, or willful ignorance about public health versus individual health, and people either not knowing or deliberately misinforming with respect to the difference between individual health and individual health choices and protecting the health of a community. And that's one thing that was really frustrating to me. It was like, what about public health do you not understand when it's public health, right? But we saw lots of examples of people not choosing to recognize the importance of the goal is to protect the community, and therefore there are certain interventions which are done to protect that community. And so, okay, I'll get off my soapbox now about that. But back to my cheesy clip art here, and that is that there are just these natural links. And so I think my talk is linking these things. You could have used bridging, an overused term, but I like bridging, connecting, right? There are links between all three of these areas that then allow us to more fully understand and hopefully better manage issues with respect to all of these areas, right? And I'll talk about that, and you'll see that here in a minute. Now that there's still more definitions, mind you, but we can now then talk about what I think helps link all these areas and helps improve decision making in these areas of decision making for the environment, decision making for public health, and that is risk assessment. Now you see here I've got risk analysis, but we'll get there. We'll get to risk assessment here in a moment. So first we take a little step back and talk about an umbrella term that covers risk assessment, and that is risk analysis. And you can see by the diagram here to the left that kind of in this triangle approach, you can see the three areas of risk analysis, which is risk assessment, risk communication, and risk management. And so risk analysis arose, it's arguable when it actually arose, but definitely the early 70s to mid 70s to late 70s is when it kind of took off and flowered. And that is that it arose as a formalized discipline by statutory frameworks for the regulation of health and environmental hazard and risk. And the classic one that immediately comes to mind is Environmental Protection Agency, 1972, a statutory framework that then allowed for regulation of health, environmental hazard, and risk. And so that's what I mean by that. And what is risk analysis? Basically that, what I say here, knowledge-based description of risk, which is a science-driven process that's integrated with social, cultural, economic, and political considerations. And so you notice here what's really interesting is that there's the knowledge-based description of risk, which is the science-y part. And then there's this integration with social, cultural, economic, and political considerations, which I'll talk a little bit more about. Now, it gets messy, of course. And so here's a little diagram I've made and use in classes and other presentations with respect to what do we mean by risk assessment? What do we mean by risk management? What do we mean by risk communication? And you can see here, I was trying to capture it, some of the complexity in this little bit of a Venn diagram thing, pointing out the different areas that all of these entail and the overlap between them, and also bringing in benefits assessment, because many times we look at not only risk, but we look at benefit associated with these different areas. And you can see here where psychologic and sociologic factors come into play, where public and political opinions come into play, legislative mandates, and regulatory decisions. So now I think we're ready to go to risk assessment. What is risk assessment? How does it differ from risk analysis? Remember, risk assessment is the knowledge-based part. It's the science-y part, so to speak. And so you see here, it's a formalized basis for the objective evaluation of risk, and all the assumptions and uncertainties are clearly evident. They're laid out such that anyone could technically go back and reconstruct the risk assessment that was done. It is not a statement from a risk assessor that I'm the expert, I'm the risk assessor, and here's the risk, and you trust me because I'm the risk assessor. That is not what risk assessment is about. It's about laying everything out and so that everything is clearly evident. And so one thing that very obviously typifies risk assessment as a discipline is that it is inherently multidisciplinary. Anytime you talk about looking at the probability of harm, the probabilities associated with risk, which is what risk is as a probability, you're talking about needing to pull in, especially environmental risk issues, you're needing to pull in information and knowledge from physics to chemistry to biology, toxicology, you name it, modeling, mathematics to understand or to assess a risk. And so what I kind of argue here, as you'll see as we go through some examples, I argue that that one way to kind of help understand all these various areas is with risk assessment, and comparative risk assessment in particular, which is my world. That's what the world I live in. And so really it's quite simple. It's comparative means just that. If you're looking at multiple options, you compare qualitatively and quantitatively those options when it comes to risk. You're comparing different environmental risks so that hopefully you can make more informed and improved decision making. And so sounds straightforward, right? It's what you think we do all the time, but ironically, it's not what we do all the time. There usually is the assessment of maybe one option, and then that's presented, but then not presenting the risks associated with other options. And that one of those options might even be the do nothing strategy, right? Well, what if we do nothing? What are the risks? That's an important thing to quantify with respect to comparative risk assessment. And I love this. We'll kind of leave formal risk assessment here in the next couple slides, but I love this quotation by Sheila Jasanoff from 1993, and Sheila Jasanoff is a former president of the Society for Risk Analysis, and it really hits at the heart of it to offer a principled way of organizing what we know about the world, particularly about its weak spots and creaky joints. And I just love that, because that is exactly what risk assessment does. So what do we do in risk assessment? And so one of the things we do is use this Red Book paradigm. It's still kind of the dominant paradigm around the world. It was developed in the US first, and then it's been adopted in various ways around the world. And it's called Red Book paradigm because the book that was produced by the NRC, National Research Council, and a National Academy Press had a red cover. So it's just called the Red Book. That's the reason why. And you can see it, you can see the cover on the right side of your, hopefully the right side of your screen. And so what is it? It's a logical, stepwise fashion. That's how it proceeds, in a logical, stepwise fashion. And you could see that, I won't read all this, but you could see the various steps involved. And I've got another slide that shows those steps graphically coming up. And then also important, this idea of the recursiveness of it. So basically you assess a risk using certain assumptions, and if that risk characterization shows concerns, if you exceed, say, regulatory thresholds, as an example, that's just one example, that you bring new science and more refinement to get closer to kind of the real risk. And I'll explain that in a slide too, because it's kind of hard to get your mind wrapped around that. So again, the steps of risk assessment, really important. Formulate the problem. You know, what's the scope of the assessment? Are you concerned about West Slope cutthroat trout in the entire state of Montana? Are you concerned about only a certain population in a certain area of the state with cutthroat trout? Are you concerned about only children in this population? Are you concerned about all people in this population? Another example. Then, you know, what's the hazard you're talking about? Is it mercury? Is it arsenic? Is it West Nile virus as your hazard, your entity that has the inherent ability to cause harm? And then, depending on what you're looking at, you might have dose-response relationships. You know, how much of an exposure is an exposure that causes problems? And if you're looking at a purely ecological issue with, say, invasive species, something I do in my lab, then you might be looking at kind of a density response relationship with the density of the invasive species. So there's an example there that's not quite so clean with dose response. And then you estimate exposure. Okay, we know how much exposure might be needed to cause harm. Well, how much exposure is there in the environment? Those all combine to form a risk characterization so that you have an assessment of risk. And I mentioned this recursiveness nature. This is where it's kind of different than what a lot of us as scientists do. We know all models are wrong, but some are useful, but we at least try to have a model that's fairly accurate. In risk assessment, our initial stab, we know the model is off. We know it's way off, but it's okay because it's for decision-making purposes. So we, at a tier 1 level, which is what we call tier 1, we deliberately overestimate exposure and effect to screen out negligible risks. So if you know you're deliberately grossly overestimating and you don't show a risk of concern, even with those overestimations, you don't need to go to tier 2, tier 3, tier 4, which is much more realistic, but also adds, can add literally millions of dollars to the assessment and thousands of human hours to the assessment. So that's why it's a little different than kind of what many of you listening and watching are familiar with. And so just one example of a tier 1 assumption, just so you kind of understand that, the EPA assumes that we eat, all of us, including children, that we eat 18,000 calories of food a day. Well, unless you're Michael Phelps, unless you're an Olympic swimmer in training, you do not consume 18,000 calories per day. If you did, you'd have big concerns about big health concerns just by eating that many calories of food a day. But that's what EPA does at a tier 1. 18,000 calories per day. You say, well, that's not even realistic. Well, think about what that allows. That overestimate of calories consumed per day allows for, if there's a trace level chemical in that food or an element that's a toxin, by assuming you eat 18,000 calories of that food per day, you're overestimating exposure and therefore risk. And if you do that and you're still coming under regulatory thresholds, you don't have to get more sophisticated in estimating calories consumed per day, but you're being protective, right? 18,000 is quite a bit over what all of you consume per day. And we also assume those maybe trace level residues are present in much higher levels than they actually are. And I won't go into more because there's just not enough time. And now we're getting into the nuts and bolts of environmental risk assessment course and how you go about estimating risk in these things. But it's an important, this idea of low tiers to high tiers and what they do in risk assessment is important to cover. Okay, how does this fit into everything else then? Well, we're familiar, you are familiar with, and I'm most familiar with, although not so much because I'm in the risk assessment world, familiar with the left side, right? The research side. That's what we do at research universities. We do research that adds data that inform then the middle part, which is the risk assessment part. And so we do that as risk assessors, but most of you are involved in the left side of this graphic here. And then you'll see that when you have a risk characterization, the risk assessor does the risk assessment, has a risk characterization, and oftentimes still, there's exceptions to this now, but hands off that assessment to the risk manager, who then combines those social, political, economic considerations with the sciencey part to then come up with a policy decision, a recommendation, a ruling. So there's kind of this wall between risk assessment and risk management. Well, that's going away and has gone away quite a bit in that we now have this what's called the Orange Book paradigm, and a big surprise, it's named because the book published had an orange cover. So go figure. But anyway, now there's much more involvement by the public, by stakeholders earlier on in the process, such that they're getting involved in what should we be looking at? What are ecological receptors we should be concerned about, and all those kinds of things. And that happens earlier in the process as trying to demonstrate by this graphic that you see in front of you, which is a bit of a jumbled mess, but at the same time is sort of accurate as well. We also can't forget that we, in the United States, we have a legal mandate to do risk assessment, right? We absolutely do. And so this risk assessment is from NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act. And it mandates that assessments of the risk to human health and to the environment be conducted during the decision-making process on environmental issues for all government actions. And so more or less that is done. The big debate is how well was it done? Was it, what's the quality? Did you skip over things? But ultimately, when you talk about an environmental impact statement, an environmental assessment, and related entity or related items, actions, that those are done. And I've got big problems with many of them that are done, because some of them I do feel like they're not done as thoroughly as they need to be. And in other cases, they're way overdone as well. So I've been using this graphic for years and years and years. It's one of the, since I'm like artistically challenged tremendously, this is one of the graphics I'm proud of, because I've been able to use it for years, and others have stolen it and used it as well. But this kind of shows in a nutshell a lot of things. And that is, when we have science that leads to a technology or technologies, society has to make decisions about these things. And a foundation for those decisions, because science leads to technology and risk assessment is a science-based discipline and process, is that risk assessment should ideally form the foundation when making these decisions. Now, we don't live in a technocracy, right? And I'm glad we don't. So we do live in a democracy, strained at times, but we have to make other levels and other filters and other considerations have to be brought to the fore when making a societal decision about, should this technology be used this way? Should it be used that way? How do we manage this disease risk? Do we use this technique or that technique, this technology or that technology? And that's where, economics, ethical consideration, benefits considerations, cultural issues come into play. Legal issues, of course, we can't leave the lawyers out. They love to play in this world. And even though we have separation of church and state, often we ask religious kind of questions about, as a society, do we really want to go there, right? And so that's occurring all the time. That is our reality in our democracy. Because we have that, we have a lot of interesting attitudes about the process of risk assessment, and many people think this. Absolutely, I've been accused of it. I've been asked, how can you sleep at night? Because you're just kowtowing to those who are paying for the research and coming up with a risk assessment that shows demonstrates what you wanted to demonstrate all along. And so we do have that, right? And it's our reality. We do have those allegations. I can certainly say that that even though people funding research, government agencies, industry, name your person or entity funding the research, they might ask a certain question, they might have priorities, but when you actually, as a scientist, go and do the work, you let the data reveal what the data reveal. And I know that's a gross oversimplification, and this is not a bioethics talk, so I'm going to leave that alone for now. Why do we need risk analysis, right? Why do we do risk assessment? I know this might be a little bit hard to read, but this is from an op-ed in the Daily Chronicle, in the Chronicle from many years ago now, when they used to list the person's address when they wrote a letter to the editor. But you can see here, speak out against gravel pit proposal near airport. And I've highlighted a few things that basically smoke and chemical and grime-laden air floating whichever direction the wind happens to be blowing. This debris may land on your buildings, get inside your houses. It could lead to health problems. This type of operation can cause hazardous spills to seep down into our soils. It can disturb the groundwater. Also, pools of water sitting around collecting insects, which can spread diseases to humans and livestock. And they can, basically birds can be sucked up in airplane mode, or the debris, the dust can be sucked up into airplane motors, and the bird interaction, as you see there with that. And this is why we need risk analysis, right? All of those things this person is pointing out are hazards, that a gravel pit does have the inherent ability to cause these harms. However, hazard is not the same thing as risk. Risk, you have to say, well, under what circumstances might that occur? How much is that going to occur? How often is that going to occur? What's the exposure level compared to the inherent ability to cause harm? And that's what we often miss in a lot of public conversations about risk issues. And so again, this idea of risk analysis allows us to then move beyond just thinking about hazard and the toxin du jour. The paper released today says coffee's bad for you. The paper released tomorrow might say, no, coffee's really good for you. Drink coffee, as one example, right? And so this is why we have this concept of risk assessment and risk analysis to inform decision-making about issues that affect the environment and affect public health. So now getting into some brief examples of how I think all this sort of plays out. You can see here a quotation from a concerned citizen about West Nile virus. And I won't read this to you, you could read it. But notice it's like, well, I hear about this disease, but I also am worried about like spraying for mosquitoes that knock down the female mosquitoes that can transmit the virus that causes the disease, right? And so back to the scales of justice here, which is the bigger risk? The West Nile virus or the techniques or tactics used to manage mosquito populations that cause these diseases? So, and so here is where we bring in environmental science, link it to environmental health, and end up with public health issues as well. And so we have these air, soil, water models that help us predict physicochemical properties and then, or incorporate physicochemical properties of the environment, and then make predictions about our exposure and the environment's exposure to, say, some of these mosquito pesticides that are used to knock down mosquitoes. So you can see here, I'm not going into any detail with respect to all these fancy models, and some aren't that fancy. They're pretty simple to use. That's why I can do it. But you incorporate all of these things that many of you on the call are familiar with, for sure, with respect to environmental science. And then you take those values that predict kind of environmental concentrations based on biotic and abiotic components of the environment, and plug them into exposure models that estimate people's exposure, but not just people's exposure. You can do livestock, wildlife, which is important for some of, in terms of protection goals for these management tactics. And ultimately get to risk characterization as part of this. And this is grossly simplified, and I just cannot, it's not the purpose of this talk today to go step through all the things we do for risk to wildlife, pets, livestock, and so on and so forth. But this, from just a human risk and a comparative risk perspective, gives us some flavor of what we're talking about. So if you look at West Nile virus infection, when you have an outbreak in any area of the country, typically a person has about a 3% risk of being infected. And with West Nile infection, only about 20%, so 1 in 5 people, experience clinical signs of illness. So 80% don't they're infected, but they don't experience any illness. 20% do. And some who are infected, 0.7%, as you see here, experience encephalitis. And the case fatality rate, now these are those who are experiencing illness and go to a doctor, go to the hospital, it's 4 to 18% mortality rate. So pretty scary, pretty appreciable if you are infected and show signs of illness, 4 to 18% mortality rate. Now compare that to worst case, kind of what we call reasonable worst case exposure to, in this case, an insecticide that's used to knock down, in an outbreak situation, that's used to knock down female mosquitoes that are carrying the virus. And that is resmethrin, is the common chemical name for that insecticide. Well, you have about, your exposure is basically half of 1%, or 0.6% of the EPA threshold. And the EPA threshold is 1/100th of an exposure in which there are no clinical signs of toxicity from the most sensitive toxicity test. I know that's a lot. I'm not going to bore you with more clarification there, but it's not 1/2 of 1% of a lethal dose. That is not the case at all. It's 1/2 of 1% of a dose that has been shown to cause no clinical signs of toxicity. And so therefore you can conclude the risk of any adverse effects would be negligible. And so all of these things can be combined, and you can do it the same for wildlife and pets and whatever, to compare risks of one thing, in this case, the risks of disease, with the risks of management tactics to try to manage that disease. And you're going all the way then from environmental inputs, environmental science inputs, to public health consequences and decisions that need to be made for the public health. Another example here is we now have genetically engineered mosquitoes that have been developed in laboratory, not released to the field. We're getting close to being able to do cage studies in the field with these. And in this case, it's Anopheles gambiae, which transmits falciparum malaria in sub-Saharan Africa. Tremendous public health issue. Absolutely. No matter how you dice and slice. Falciparum malaria is nasty and really holds back sub-Saharan Africa in terms of economic development because of the tremendous health consequences. So this is a case where we have questions, right? We have the ability now to have CRISPR technology and gene drive technology using super Mendelian inheritance that can move a gene through a population, in this case Anopheles gambiae, and it's called a double sex gene because the gene produces in both males and females, and the important part here is the females, produces kind of attributes of both sexes, hence double sex. Well, both sexes in this case does not mean you're a hermaphrodite and you can reproduce both as a male and a female. It means that you cannot reproduce. And so you're producing individuals that cannot reproduce. And so then over time you lower the population. Well, obviously, new technology, scary. We need to address, what are we talking about here? And in a whole series of conferences, public hearings with regulators in sub-Saharan Africa, they pointed out that these were what we were concerned about in these African consultations: human health, biodiversity, and notice water quality here. Well, as the water quality decreased, you've got to have these genes, and the gene comes from a fruit fly. It's a fruit fly gene. The mosquito has it as well. So with gene editing, you're basically modifying a gene that's already there to produce this double sex attribute. But there's concerns about water quality. And so Foundation for the NIH, the Gene Convene Global Collaborative, after having these consultations got a hold of me and said, we know what you do. Can you look at comparative risks between conventional larvicides that kill larvae in water, mosquito larvae in water, look at the risks of those, and then also look at the risks of potential risk, because we haven't put these things in the field yet. And we don't have all the information that we truly would need, but look at some of the issues associated with comparative risks with the GE mosquitoes. And so I said yes, and have worked on a project with Marnie Ralston in my lab, and many of you know Marnie, and we're looking kind of at this very issue of looking at primary effects, secondary effects, kind of scoping exercises, and then looking at data, paucity in data, where we have some data, where we don't. And I'm not going to go through all of these now, but you can see kind of a conceptual map here that charts this out. And then coming up with looking at comparatively larvicides and what are the risks, what are the risk questions, looking at gene-derived mosquitoes, and what is the current weight of evidence, where might we see certain risks, such that we're able, again, when it comes to larvicides, you're looking at the inescapable involvement of the environment, of physicochemical properties that determine the concentrations of larvicides in the environment, and with gene-derived mosquitoes as well. What types of environments produce Anopheles gambiae? And then if you add these genetically engineered mosquitoes that can breed, that then over time lower the population of Anopheles gambiae, what are the consequences of that? In this case, specifically to water quality. Now I want to cover another really interesting example, and this is Miranda Margetts. Dr. Miranda Margetts is when she was a PhD student here, and her project, which is kind of looking very interestingly at kind of starting with a public health issue, and that is both legal and illicit drug use, illegal drug use, and opioids and cocaine, but also prescription opioids, and looking at that problem, but then kind of saying, okay, starting from public health, what are the environmental health issues associated with that when it comes to those drugs entering wastewater? And so when they enter wastewater, you've got effects potentially on aquatic organisms and healthy, the quality of water and soil health and all these things associated with that as well. So really, really interesting to look at then what is getting into wastewater, and then what is getting out in terms of that could have ecological effects. And not going through all these, you can see some of the drugs on the left-hand portion, and then ecotoxicological thresholds to protect aquatic organisms, in this case, I believe fish, primarily here in this graph. And you can see, based on measurements of wastewater and these drugs in wastewater, what we might be dealing with respect to risk to fish and other aquatic organisms. And here you see a couple examples, codeine and morphine, and what is the risk, in this case described as a percentage of the threshold. And you can see here a couple examples of that from Miranda's work. So really interesting interactions with environmental health and public health. There's also, we don't have to just think about public health like the way we comfortably think about it. We can also think about it as kind of public health as enjoyment and wellness in a community. And here's some work from Bill Kleindl that looks at kind of combining everything from societal factors and ecological factors when it comes to forests and water, and then ecosystem services is a big area for him, and looking at how all these things interact in terms of final quality of the environment, which then has knock-on effects with respect to public health, and thinking about public health more broadly. I've been talking about research, and I want to finish up here, getting a plug in. We're at a land-grant university, state university. Our responsibility is education, in addition to research. And so when it comes to education, I'm really privileged to be on a big team of an NIH SEPA grant that was awarded to MSU, and it's called My Home, My Health, Place-Based Public Health Resources for Rural Educators. And here's a case where we're looking at educating, kind of training the trainers, educating educators to educate then their students with respect to disease ecology and how the environment interacts and influences health, environmental diseases, infectious diseases, and how all these things kind of combine so that we're looking much more broadly at disease ecology and the environment and public health. And many of you might have heard about One Health, which is this big, it's been going on for several years. I'm not an expert on it. I've never even tried to see about funding or anything, but have kind of kept aware of it. And that is this very large global effort, very large CDC effort with respect to, as it says here, multi-sectoral transdisciplinary approach, working at all these various levels with the goal of achieving optimal health outcomes, recognizing the interconnection between people, animals, plants, and their shared environment. And that's really where I think 21st century environmental science, environmental health, and public health are going, is to embrace the interconnectedness that's expressed here in One Health. And when I look at kind of MSU's role in all this, I think because of investments in the past several years in biomedical research, education, the growth in the College of Nursing, attention paid to health disparities, rural health, and investments in environmental science and environmental health, that I think we can play a very strong leadership role at MSU in this kind of vision, this transdisciplinary vision, in linking all of these areas together using comparative risk assessment to help show the apparent linkages. And I just have to pass on this very brief anecdote. I'm on a search committee for a watershed analyst person who would come in, faculty member in my department, Land Resources and Environmental Sciences, and every single person who's interviewed so far has mentioned the absolute importance of thinking about environmental science transdisciplinarily, if that's a word, and thinking about it from a transdisciplinary perspective. And that includes embracing the social sciences and looking at all of these things. So I think the future is a bright one. And I certainly would get on a soapbox here and say we need to pay extra attention here, because we've seen with the COVID-19 global pandemic how these things can all be interrelated and how we need to understand these things from a much more comprehensive perspective. So with that, this is my last slide showing the obligatory bridge linking these islands that I've talked about in these areas. So with that, thank you very much. And I think there's a little bit of time for questions if there are any.
Thank you so much, Bob, for such an interesting presentation. I'd like to open it up to the audience for questions. If you would like to unmute yourself or type your question in the chat, or you can use the raise hand function.
Okay, and Paige, do you want me to read
Sure.
Okay. This question is from Michelle. What type of mosquitoes have been released into the environment to mitigate human pathogen transmission? For example, Wolbachia containing mosquitoes, non-gene drive genetically modified mosquitoes. I thought that gene drive mosquitoes had been released in Florida. Yes, they have. And those are just what you're talking about, Michelle. Those are not the CRISPR-Cas9 gene drive, gene edited mosquitoes, but these are there's what is it called? Friendly Aedes. And so Aedes aegypti mosquitoes, one is through Wolbachia, which is a bacterium that is that's released in large numbers of mosquitoes that helps kind of sterilize. They influence fecundity and fertility of mosquitoes. That's not a genetically engineered approach, but it is an approach where you infect male mosquitoes, release tens of thousands of male mosquitoes in an area to hopefully tamp down the population of Aedes aegypti, which transmits dengue and yellow fever and several other diseases. But there's also this friendly Aedes, which has been genetically engineered to basically it's basically the larvae don't develop to adults, so they die before they develop to adults because they have a gene that causes them to die before they develop. So those have been released, and in Florida they have been released in certain areas. And this is really fascinating because some communities have said, no way, this is Frankenstein stuff, it's way too scary, you're not doing this. Other communities have embraced it, and even different communities in the Florida Keys, which is really interesting. It's important, though, to know it has been well studied, and we have environmental assessments and impact statements. And given the biology, the nature of this, it does stay within Aedes aegypti and locally. And what people often forget is that Aedes aegypti is not native to the Western Hemisphere. It is native to Africa. It does not belong in Brazil or Argentina or Texas or Florida or Central America. It is an invasive alien species, and that often gets left out of conversations about how do we manage this issue. So, thanks, Michelle. Great question.
Do we have any other questions? All right. Well,
Oh,
go
there you
ahead,
go.
Tracy.
I'm one of Bob's, whoops, biggest fans. I'm on two phones. Sorry, my microphone broke. There we go. So I'm on my phone and on Webex. Yeah, I'm quite skilled. I'm one of Bob's biggest fans, and I wonder, how do you help our university to think across these transdisciplinary ideas? How do we move forward with this?
Well, that's we had that answer, we'd all be in good shape, right? Challenging for sure. One thing I think helps at MSU is, and some people here might disagree with me, but ever since I got here, which is 20 years now, it's been a university that's always struck me as we have silos, but the silos are they're not rigid, right? And so we definitely have we definitely reach across the aisle, so to speak, in terms of from people in one department to another department, and even across colleges, of course. And that's a culture we have here. And I think we should manage to our strengths. We build on that culture and promote that we need to be siloless, and we need to address things from a multidisciplinary perspective. And because of that, we have to work together, and somehow we have to I'm not saying restructure officially, but we have to challenge the notion that, well, we have departments because of this and this and this, we have colleges because of this and this and this, is to challenge those notions that we even need those. Now, do we need those from an administrative perspective? I would argue probably yes, because it's just the way it does make sense to have structures like that. However, we don't have to functionally be like that. We can reach across, work together. And I think Montana State is in a great position to make that happen, especially with all the attention that we've paid, again, to environmental health and thinking about these issues from a medical/environmental health perspective. And I would hope to move the needle on that through my proselytizing, and for upper administrators to maybe start to champion or embrace initiatives to get us there. I know that was very nebulous and pie in the sky, but I don't know what else to say, Tracy.
Thanks.
No, a couple. We're out of time, but there's a couple. Let's see. Michelle has another one. I'll go to Mojde. And Michelle, you and I can talk offline about this. Could you please expand on the educational programs for teaching educators for rural communities and how a graduate student in LRAS may get involved? We'll take that offline too. There's a couple folks here who are part of the, I assume you mean the SEPA program, My Home, My Health, and Jamie Cornish is on, who's really the one to thank for this whole thing. And then Nora Smith is also a program manager for this. So get a hold of us. We'll talk through this because I think there's some opportunities there. And thank you so much for your interest in the My Home, My Health program. And I don't know, Jamie, if you wanted to just say anything else, but or Nora about that, but we can definitely help offline.
Yeah, probably just better to get a hold of us. I'll put my email in the chat box.
Good.
All right. Well, it's 1 o'clock, so let's give Bob a round of applause. Thank you so much for your time and presenting at the Rough Cut. All right. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.